From the elders of Ivbiaro comes a tale not soon forgotten. Welcome to Desi Tales Africa. The sky had not wept in 11 months, and on the night the death came due, Osaru was digging. Her fingers bled into the cracked earth behind her father's hut, tearing at soil so dry it crumbled like ash. She was not planting. She was searching for the clay jar her father had buried the year she was born, the one he forbade anyone to touch, the one he visited alone every rainy season and returned from with tears he never explained. Tonight he lay dying inside, his breath rattling like dry leaves, and he had whispered only one thing before his voice gave out: dig it up. Give it back. Before the moon is full, or the death falls on you instead. She had no idea what it was. She only knew her father, Osaru, once the most trusted rainmaker in 3 villages, had not called the rains in over a decade, and no one, not even the elders, knew why he'd stopped. If you're watching this tonight, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you believe old deaths always find their way home, hit subscribe before the story finds you too. Her spade struck something hard. Not stone, clay, sealed with wax gone brittle with age. She pulled the jar free, and the moment her palms closed around it, a wind moved through the compound that had no business existing in a night this still. The neighboring dogs began howling in unison, then stopped, all at once, as if someone had silenced them. Osaru was 19, and until that night she had believed her father's illness was simply age catching up to a man who'd worked too hard for too long. She had believed the drought was bad luck, the kind that visited every generation or so. She had believed, above all, that her father was a good man, stern, private, but good, the kind of father who carried water for widows and never raised his voice. She was about to learn that goodness and guilt were not opposites. Sometimes they lived in the same chest, taking turns breathing. Inside the jar was not what she expected. No charm, no bones, no ceremonial dust. Just a single carved stone the size of a fist, shaped like a raindrop, warm to the touch despite the cold night, and beneath it, folded so many times it had turned soft as cloth, a strip of woven raffia inscribed with symbols she didn't recognize but somehow, impossibly, understood the moment her eyes touched them. 1 rain for 1 child. That was the price. That was always the price. Her hands went cold. She had heard the story of her birth only in fragments, that her mother had died bringing her into the world during the worst drought Ivbiaro had ever known, a drought so severe that 3 villages nearly emptied before Osaru, then a young and unproven rainmaker, walked alone into the Ikorododo forest and did not return for 7 days. When he came back, the rains came with him, 3 days of storm so relentless the river swelled over its banks for the first time in memory. Everyone called it a miracle. No one asked what he traded for it. Osaru sat in the dirt with the stone in her lap, and for the first time in her life she understood why her father flinched every time she asked about her mother. Why he never remarried. Why, every year during the first rain, he disappeared into the forest alone and came back hollow-eyed, refusing food for days. He hadn't stopped calling the rains because he'd lost his gift. He had stopped because he was afraid of what the spirit would ask for next. A cough came from inside the hut, wet, weak, final sounding. She scrambled up, jar in hand, and pushed through the doorway to find her father's eyes open, fixed on her with a terror she had never once seen on his face in 19 years, not even the year the soldiers came through demanding grain. You dug it up, he rasped. It wasn't a question. Osaru, put it back. Put it back now, before. Before what? Her voice cracked. Papa, what did you do? What did you trade for the rain that brought me here? His hand shot out and gripped her wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been left in a body so wasted by illness. Not what, he whispered. Who? Outside, the wind that had circled the compound moments before suddenly stilled, the kind of silence that comes right before something enormous. And in that silence, faint at first but growing, Osaru heard something that made the hair rise on her arms, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the dry riverbed that hadn't held water in 11 months. Something was walking up out of the empty river. And it was coming toward the hut. Osaru's first instinct was to bar the door, but her father shook his head weakly. It cannot be locked out. It was never locked out. It has been waiting 11 months for me to die so it could finally collect from someone who could still pay. He closed his eyes, and for a moment she thought he'd slipped away. Then, haltingly, the truth came. The night he'd walked into Akorododo forest, desperate, his young wife already fevered and failing in childbirth, he had not simply prayed for rain. He had bargained. The spirit of the river, Omophon, the old people called her, though Ojiamwoniai had never dared speak the name aloud since, offered him a choice. Rain enough to save the villages, and enough strength passed through the storm to save his wife and unborn child both. But nothing sacred moves without cost. The spirit did not want grain, or gold, or gratitude. She wanted a promise, that when the child came of age, she would walk into the forest of her own will, and give 1 full year of her life in service to the river, to tend it, to listen to it, to learn what it means to belong to something older than yourself. Ojiamwoniai had agreed. And then, terrified, he had spent 19 years finding reasons to delay telling his daughter, hoping, foolishly, he now saw, that the spirit would forget, or that he could die before the reckoning came and take the guilt into the ground with him. She kept her word, he whispered. Your mother lived 3 more days after you were born. Long enough to hold you. Long enough to name you. I told myself that was mercy. I never once thought about whether it was mercy for her, or a debt she was made to pay so I could feel forgiven. If this story has your chest tight right now, let it sit for a second, then tell us in the comments what you'd have done in Ojiamwoniai's place, and give the video a like if a father's guilt has ever quietly reshaped your own life. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Osaru rose on legs that didn't feel like her own. Whatever stood beyond that threshold had waited 19 years, had let a good man live under the weight of a promise not fully paid, had allowed a drought to strangle 3 villages simply because it was owed something and had not been given it. She could run. She could bar herself inside with her dying father and pretend she'd never dug up the jar at all. But she thought of every dry well she'd walked past that week, every mother boiling the same thin soup for the 3rd night running, every child too weak to chase the goats anymore. The debt was not only her father's. It had become the whole village's, whether they knew it or not. She opened the door. There was no monster waiting in the moonlight. That was the first shock. Instead stood a woman, tall and unhurried, her skin the deep, wet brown of river clay, her wrapper woven from something that shimmered like moving water even when she was perfectly still. Her eyes, when they found Osaru's, were not cruel. They were simply patient, the way water is patient, willing to wear down mountains if given enough time. You have your mother's stubbornness, the spirit said, and something in Osaru's chest cracked open at the word mother, spoken with a familiarity that suggested this was not the first time these two had stood close to one another, even if Osaru had no memory of it. You knew her, Osaru said. I held her while she died, Omophon answered, and there was no cruelty in it, only fact. She did not resent me for it. She resented that her husband would spend the rest of his life too afraid to tell you the truth, instead of raising you to understand what your family owed and why. Here the twist Osaru had not seen coming settled over her like cold water. The spirit had not come tonight to punish her father, or to drag Osaru into the forest against her will. She had come because the debt, unpaid for 19 years, had begun to poison the bargain itself. The drought was not random cruelty. It was the promise cuddling, the way any unspoken truth cuddles the longer it's left in the dark. The land was thirsting because the family bound to the river had spent 2 decades running from what they owed it. I am not here to take your year by force, Omophon said. I have never taken anything by force. Your father offered. I accepted. That is the whole of it. But a promise made and never spoken becomes a wound instead of a gift. I have come only to ask, now that you know, will you honor what your mother's dying breath already agreed to on your behalf, or will you let this drought take everyone in Ivbiaro because your father could not find the courage to say 4 words to his own daughter? Behind her, Osaru heard her father struggling to rise from his sickbed, heard him begin to weep, not the quiet, dignified grief she'd known her whole life, but something raw and unguarded, 19 years of silence breaking all at once. Osaru looked back at the spirit, then at her dying father, then out at the black, starving fields stretching beyond the compound. This was the moment everything her whole life had been quietly building toward, though she hadn't known it until an hour ago. 1 year, she said. In the forest. For the river. For the river, Omofon agreed. And for the mother you never got to know beyond a name whispered at your naming ceremony. We're at the heart of it now. If you've made it this far, subscribe if you love stories where the past refuses to stay buried, because the ending is going to change everything you think you understood about who really owed this debt. What followed was not punishment. Osaru walked into Ikorododo forest at dawn, alone, as her mother had once been carried into it in fever and fear. But where her mother's path had been one of desperate bargaining, Osaru's was one of choosing, and the forest, it seemed, understood the difference. She spent that year learning the river's moods the way a daughter learns a parent's face, the low murmur before a flash flood, the particular stillness before drought broke, the songs the water carried down from the mountains that no one in the village had heard in a generation. She learned, too, fragments of her mother, small things Omofon shared almost carelessly, the way she used to hum while grinding pepper, the stubborn tilt of her chin when she disagreed with Ojiamoniai, the fact that she had wanted to name her daughter Osaru, God's own time, because she believed the child had arrived exactly when she was needed, and not a moment before. When Osaru walked out of the forest 12 months later, the rains had already returned to Ivbiaro 3 months prior. Omofon had not waited for the full year to lift the drought, once she saw the promise was finally being honored in good faith rather than fear. The village fields were green again. Children who had grown thin now ran instead of shuffled. And her father, against every expectation, had survived, his innards breaking the same week the first rain fell, as though his body, too, had simply been waiting for the truth to finally leave his chest. He met her at the edge of the forest, older, thinner, but standing on his own 2 feet for the first time in over a year. He did not apologize with words, he had used most of those already, in the long nights he'd spent, unknowingly, confessing everything to a daughter who could hear him through the trees, carried on water the way secrets are always eventually carried, no matter how deep you bury them. Instead, he simply said, "Your mother would be proud of the woman who paid what I was too afraid to." Osaru became, in time, the rainmaker Ivbiaro speaks of even now, not because she inherited the gift by blood, though perhaps she did, but because she had learned something her father took 19 years and a near death to understand, that the debts we inherit don't disappear when we refuse to look at them. They wait. They gather interest in silence. And they are almost always cheaper to pay honestly and early than to run from until they come collecting everything at once. Before we close tonight's tale, subscribe, share this story with someone who needs the reminder, and tell us in the comments, what's the biggest lesson you're walking away with tonight? The elders of Ivbiaro still say it plainly to any child old enough to understand, a promise unspoken is not a promise forgotten, it is only a debt left to grow teeth in the dark. Until the next tale, may wisdom walk with you.